The city that once judged the world is now burning in its own lies. And the man exposing it all is not from the West, but from Africa. New York, a city that once symbolized power, order, and progress, now stands on the edge of chaos. The streets that once echoed with ambition are filled with anger, confusion, and fear. Sirens scream through the night as protesters flood Times Square, their voices rising against the lies that have ruled for decades. Something historic is happening. The Western world, long seen as the center of truth and democracy, is being forced to face its own reflection, and it doesn't like what it sees. In the midst of the turmoil, one man's arrival changes everything. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young African leader who defied empires, has come to speak where no one dared before. His presence in New York has shaken the foundation of global politics. What was meant to be a simple diplomatic meeting has turned into a confrontation between truth and deception. The world watches, breathless, as a new voice from Africa prepares to expose the hypocrisy of the powerful. Months before the chaos in New York, the story began far away, in the heart of Africa. In Burkina Faso, a nation long overlooked by the world's media, a revolution of spirit had already begun. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young soldier driven by purpose rather than power, had risen not through corruption or greed, but through the will to protect his people. He had seen his homeland stripped of its dignity, gold, uranium, and land all taken by foreign hands, leaving behind poverty, hunger, and despair. For years, Western nations called it aid. They spoke of democracy, development, and partnership. But behind every handshake and smiling photograph lay a darker truth. The same countries that preached freedom were the ones building invisible chains around Africa. Traoré saw it all. He watched as Western companies extracted billions from the continent, while African children studied under trees and soldiers fought with outdated weapons. He understood that Africa's poverty was not a curse but a design, so when he took power he made a promise, not to obey but to restore, to make Africa rise again, not as a servant but as an equal among nations. His words spread like wildfire across the continent. To the West he was dangerous. To Africa he was hope reborn. Then came the invitation, an official request from the United Nations to address global leaders in New York. Many believed it would be a polite appearance, a token gesture to show that the African revolution could be contained. But Traoré's silence during the flight to America told another story. He wasn't coming to play politics. He was coming to speak truth where it hurt the most. As his plane touched down in New York, the world didn't yet realize history was about to be rewritten, not by the powerful, but by the defiant voice of Africa. As Ibrahim Traoré's convoy entered New York City, tension pulsed through the air like an approaching storm. The skyline stood tall and proud, but beneath its glittering lights, unease rippled through the streets. Protesters had gathered on both sides of the avenue. Some carried African flags, their chants echoing with pride and hope. Africa will rise. Others shouted accusations, waving signs that labeled him a threat, a radical, an outsider who didn't belong on Western soil. Yet, Traoré remained calm. His face revealed no fear, no anger, only purpose. Cameras followed his every move, hungry to capture controversy. Western journalists whispered among themselves, crafting headlines before he even spoke. Traoré, the African firebrand, the rebel soldier who challenges the West. They didn't understand that he hadn't come for war. He had come for truth. Inside the United Nations building, the atmosphere was no different. Diplomats in suits walked briskly, their expressions cold and cautious. The grand marble hall that once symbolized peace now felt heavy with suspicion. In every corner, whispers spread like smoke. He's unpredictable. We don't know what he'll say. Traoré walked past them with steady steps, his uniform standing out against the sea of formal ties and tailored jackets. For many, his presence was a reminder of everything the West feared, a man who couldn't be bought, silenced, or controlled. As he reached the assembly hall, hundreds of eyes turned toward him. The chatter faded. The room fell silent. Cameras clicked, pens hovered over notebooks, and screens around the world went live. He stood before the microphone, looked up, and began to speak. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of centuries. "You call us poor," he said, his tone firm, measured, unshaken, "yet your wealth is mined from our soil. You call us unstable, but your bombs have fallen on our cities. You claim to bring freedom, yet every leader who defends his people is branded a dictator. The hall froze. Some looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Others whispered in disbelief. The translation earpieces buzzed in dozens of languages. But no translation could soften the truth. He continued, every word cutting deeper than the last. Africa does not ask for pity. We ask for fairness. We do not want aid. We want accountability. For too long you have fed on our silence, and now that we speak you call it rebellion. Outside, news networks broadcast his speech live. Social media exploded. Hashtags like Ibrahim Traoré Truth and Like Africa Speaks flooded timelines. In African capitals, people gathered around televisions, cheering through tears. Across Western cities, citizens began to question, is he right? But not everyone celebrated. In private boardrooms, anger simmered. Politicians, investors, and military advisors watched with clenched jaws. A single speech was threatening to unravel decades of carefully maintained control. Traoré's words were more dangerous than weapons, because they awakened awareness. By evening, chaos was spreading through the Western media. Some channels tried to silence his message, cutting out portions of his speech. Others twisted his words, calling him a nationalist, a populist, a threat to democracy. But it was too late. The truth had already escaped the walls of the UN. Meanwhile, on the streets of New York, crowds grew larger. African students, activists, and even ordinary Americans joined together, demanding answers. They held up signs that read, "Let Africa breathe," "End the hypocrisy," and "Justice for all nations." Inside his hotel room that night, Traoré sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He knew what would come next, what resistance, fear, manipulation. But he also knew that something powerful had begun. This wasn't just about one speech. It was a spark, a moment that would ripple across continents. A young African leader had stood before the mightiest powers on earth and reminded them that the world was changing. New York didn't know it yet, but it was no longer the center of the story. The story now belonged to those who had been silenced for generations, and their voice had just begun to rise. The morning after Traoré's historic speech, New York woke to a storm of confusion and outrage. The newspapers were chaotic. Some hailed him as a revolutionary voice of truth, while others accused him of igniting unrest. Television networks ran his words on repeat, dissecting each line with both admiration and fear. Yet behind the noise, something far more dangerous was unfolding. It started with a leak. An anonymous account uploaded a series of classified documents online, thousands of pages revealing hidden agreements, secret military deals, and financial manipulations between Western corporations and African regimes. The files showed how aid money, meant for schools and hospitals, was rerouted into private accounts and weapon sales. The revelation spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media was in turmoil. Hashtags like Bonnier Western Leaks and Truth Exposed trended worldwide. Citizens across Europe and America took to the streets, demanding answers from their governments. In Africa, people watched with disbelief. The truth they had lived for decades was finally in the open. The very nations that had accused them of corruption were now drowning in evidence of their own. The stock market tumbled. Major corporations faced instant backlash. Western leaders scrambled to contain the outrage, calling emergency meetings and blaming foreign interference. But the damage was irreversible. The world had seen the mask fall. In the chaos, journalists traced the timing of the leaks. All evidence pointed to one fact. The files were released just hours after Traoré's UN speech. Some claimed it was planned by his government. Others whispered that a Western insider had done it, inspired by his courage. No one knew the truth, but one thing was certain. The world would never look at Western morality the same way again. That evening, New York was unrecognizable. Thousands flooded the streets near the United Nations. Protesters clashed with police, buildings were vandalized, and fires burned through the night. The city that once stood as a symbol of power now looked like a scene of judgment. Inside his quiet hotel room, Traoré watched the news unfold. His reflection in the glass merged with the flickering chaos outside. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply whispered, "The truth always finds its way." By dawn, New York had become the stage for a global awakening. What was meant to silence an African leader had instead exposed the empire's deepest secrets. The world had turned upside down, and for the first time justice wasn't echoing from the West. It was roaring from Africa. Days passed after the chaos that shook New York, but the world didn't return to normal. Something had shifted, not just in governments or markets, but in the human mind. Across continents, people began to question everything they had been taught. News anchors who once dismissed African voices now spoke of reform. Students debated justice, independence, and equality in classrooms. Even within Western nations, citizens demanded transparency, asking their leaders the question once whispered only in secret: who truly rules the world? In Africa, Traoré's words echoed like thunder. Streets were filled with pride, murals painted with his image, and children spoke his name as a symbol of courage. He hadn't brought war, he had brought awakening. His truth had pierced through the noise of global propaganda and reminded millions that dignity cannot be imported. It must be reclaimed. Meanwhile, New York began to rebuild its image, but something inside the city had cracked forever. The people who once viewed Africa through the lens of pity now saw strength, resilience, and clarity. The world had witnessed the power of one man standing against centuries of manipulation. As Traoré boarded his plane to return home, the sky over New York was calm again, but not peaceful. The calm felt like the pause before a new era. Reporters shouted questions, but he gave none of them answers. His silence said more than any speech ever could. In every corner of the world, one thought remained: if the truth from Africa could shake New York, what else is the world hiding from us? That is the question left hanging in the air, one that no government, no journalist, and no nation can easily escape. So ask yourself, when the truth finally stands before you, will you have the courage to face it? Or will you turn away? If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. Tell the world, has the time come for justice to speak louder than power? The world may try to bury the truth, but as history has shown, the truth always rises. What happened in New York wasn't just a political moment. It was a message to every nation that silence feeds corruption, and courage destroys it. Ibrahim Traoré didn't come to the West with weapons, he came with words. Words that shattered illusions, exposed deceit, and reminded humanity that power without justice is nothing but weakness in disguise. But this story doesn't end here, because the fight for truth never ends. After New York, Traoré returned to Africa, only to uncover an even darker secret. A betrayal hidden in plain sight. Gold stolen from the heart of his people, by those who claim to be allies. If you think this story shook the world, wait until you see what he discovered next. Watch our next video. Ibrahim Traoré exposes gold thief in shocking confrontation. And before you go, if this story inspired you, hit like, share it with the world, and subscribe for more untold truths of courage, betrayal, and justice, because the revolution of truth has only just begun.